All right, switch this one off. Okay. So the goal of this event today, this lab session, is to actually go through some of how do we make ChatGPT more deterministic. And what I mean is that asking ChatGPT a question should always provide the same answer. So we as architect, one thing that we do is we create our governance, we create standards, and we try to enforce those standards for our governance. So one of the standards that we probably create what we create during this hour session is that we create a standard to validate an API. So we want to validate the API contract, so OpenAPI standard, and we want to make sure that they follow our API standard implemented by the architecture team. That could be around probably some of the questions that we want to look at. Is it safe, right? Are they implementing the authentication at the right layer? Are they returning the right content for the right HTTP verb? Does it follow the structure expected? And also, how can we make it more automated so that they can be enabled to actually validate it themselves. And when they do come for the architecture review board, they come prepared and they know what to expect. But more importantly, make them save this time where they can actually move forward with what they implemented. But the real focus today will be around how to use something like ChatGPT. As you can see on my screen, I will be using ChatGPT for this. And but before we even jump into it, there is one question that I would like to ask is if LLM can already design APIs, right? So LLM can design APIs, it can generate architecture diagrams, it can write Terraforms code, script. What exactly is the role of an architect in 3 years? Right. I'm not saying that okay, there's other stuff people will get into the technicals and say, oh, architect don't just do design and API standard and such things. But if LLM can do most of it in terms of the design and the diagrams and the documentation and the terraforms, right? So what is the role of an architect in 3 years? Right? I'd like to see, if you can put anything in the comments, or if you want to speak now, if you raise your hand, I will, have a conversation because this, as I mentioned, is very interactive, very hands-on, and it would be good to have some conversation. Okay. All right. So today, with prompting, everybody use ChatGPT, Claude, or whatever you want to use, but we need to learn the difference between the random prompting and architecting AI, right? So when an architect uses Claude or ChatGPT, it's not the same way as just keying in any random things, right? An architect, as I mentioned earlier, works with standards or governance, wants to implement standards, wants to enforce standards. So when working with things like ChatGPT or Claude, we want to make sure that they can we can automate some of the tasks that we do. So if we just want to validate that an API meets a standard, that is a task that we can automate through generative AI, and ChatGPT is a good example for that. Uh, I'm hoping that you can all hear me. So just to set some expectations, this is a hands-on session, and you will be building a control AI component, right? Not all the way to the code, so don't worry, there's no coding involved, but we will try to avoid any of the theory fluff, right? We want to go straight to it and try to see what we can do, what we can build, right? And for this session, we will use something that we are all used to as architects, right? We know that we look into spec reviews, right? We want to make sure that any new API is being introduced within the environment, adheres to the standard, implement the standards which have been enforced through the architectural review board. But how do we stop any architectural violations, right? The only way we currently do is through reviewing the design, reviewing what's been provided by the delivery team. And so we will start with something very simple. Well, I have created a file, and this file is a very simple OpenAPI specification, and a lot of your architects already here are very familiar with it. You will usually get something like this from your development team. And we say, okay, we have some new events, we have, and this is very simple. As I mentioned, this is a very simple case where we look into provide a registration endpoint for some of the events. So, maybe your organization is organizing some events, internal events, external events, where you require participant to register. So, we have a free main section here, which is events, the registration, the agenda. And as you can see, we got some gets, and we got some posts as well, so to create a new person to register, new participants. And we can also put up the agenda. So you will get used to this. You usually get this coming in, and the developer, the lead developer, will come with some more diagrams and try to show the diagrams of what they're doing exactly. But we don't want the architecture review to turn into some diagram reviews, and we don't want to spend so much time going with our standard that we already set the last 6 months, right? Unless the standard been updated, then it makes sense to come and try to review everything else. But we need to enable the team to review, to be able to do their own review. And now, if they really deviate, anything that before going live will come in and they need to be discussed with the architects and presented correctly. But we need to make sure that we do enable them, empower them to move fast and be very agile without having to, without the architecture team being a blocker. So taking that into example, into consideration, sorry. We're discussing some of the naming conventions. So we want all the endpoints to be plural, use names, nouns, all right. And if you want to retrieve one event, you want to provide the ID, because this is what's been provided here. And so let's try to review this. Let's try to review this spec, right? So usually what we will do, we will copy this, and we will go to let's use ChatGPT. All right, so we're in ChatGPT, and we want ChatGPT to be able to review this spec for us. So usually we will say, okay, we want you to review this spec. So let's say, I want you to review this OpenAPI spec, right? And based on best practices. So I will paste in the spec, and I mean, a lot of time people are very vague when they're asking ChatGPT to review anything. So the best practices are not provided, as you can see here, and I will say, okay, just review it, and ChatGPT will, if we launch it, it will take a couple of seconds, or maybe it's already doing something. So ChatGPT will come up with its own review, all right? So OpenAPI specification is clean, readable, already quite good. All right, for several important best practices, such as logical resources, reusable component. We see all those clear tags, these are examples. Right, so I'll break this into what's good, what should be improved, advanced. It comes up with its own review. But this review that ChatGPT just carried out is not based on any of the standard established by your organization or by your architectural board, right? This is according to ChatGPT, whatever data ChatGPT was trained on, whatever best practices ChatGPT was trained on, this is what the review is based on, right? So it's very, very generic, very, very vague, and we cannot take this review, right, and say, okay, we will pass that on to a team to validate it automatically. So if a team was trying to do on it, as part of the CI/CD, this result here is not in a format that can actually be automated through anything like CI/CD. But it would be good to know, get some of your own views, right? And one of the questions is that will you deploy this inside your enterprise architecture review workflow? Do you have an architectural review workflow which reviews all the APIs coming in. Right. We'd love to see some more messages in the chat, or if anybody, as I mentioned earlier, if someone wants to mention something, then you're open to mention it. You can also join in into the Zoom call. You can join in the Zoom call and participate. Okay. So this review is very, very generic. As I mentioned, very generic. There's, talking about good use of examples. That is not what we have internally. Internally, we will have our own standard applied. So let's try to see if we can move that more into a standard base. I will go back this time to ChatGPT. And this time I will give it a role. So I will say, okay, you are an enterprise architect, enterprise API governance architect, and I want you to review to review the provider. I want you to review strictly, sorry. I want you to review on type today. Provide the standards. So we will provide a standard now, and the standard will have things like probably role ID. So let me see. I should have one of the standard there already. 1 second. I will just provide that. Okay. So you're enterprise API governance architect, and your responsibility is to review OpenAPI specifications strictly against the provided architecture standard. You must only evaluate against the provided standard, not invent rules, not assume missing information, not provide general best practice outside the standard, be deterministic and structured. If no violations are found, return an empty array, because that's very important. If there's no violation, just return an empty array. You must output strictly the JSON schema provided and do not return explanation using outside the JSON structure. Now, what is now the standard that we're going to provide for this is, remember that you need to version your standard. All right. So here is the standard. Okay. So the standard is very simple. I mean, because we only have limited time on this session, and we provided a couple of rules. We say all endpoints must be versioned using the URI versioning. So, for example, V1 resource. All post and put endpoints must define explicit request body schemas. We want to make sure that all endpoints, rule number 3, all endpoints must define 400 and 500 response code. We want to make sure that on the rule 4, authentication must use OF2 with bearer token scheme. And then resource name must use kebab case. All right. So if we go back to our Swagger and we look into the post, okay, so this is one of the posts, and we have the get events. We don't have any security implemented in this, and we can clearly see that we don't have any version already as part of the URI, right? So going back to our initial schema that we provided, the OpenAPI schema that we provided to ChatGPT, and now we're giving it a standard to actually validate against. But we also wanted to provide a certain JSON output, right? We want to make sure that it follows a systematic output that can be reused by the actual development team, right? It's very important. So the schema that we provide will be the following. 1 sec. Okay. So first of all, what we did, we provided our OpenAPI spec, very basic spec for the test, and we provided some GenAI instructions. So I want you to review this spec against some of the best practices, but we didn't mention which best practices. We didn't mention how the output should be structured, and we didn't really mention anything that can guide the generative API tool, such as ChatGPT, that we're currently using to provide us with something that can be reused internally by the team and can also be automated as part of our architectural review workflow. So now we're asking ChatGPT not only to provide carry out the review, but to follow those rules. And in order to follow those rules, we want the answer to tell us what rule ID is, what's the rule description, and what is exactly the violation. Then on top of that, we want the severity of low, medium, high to be also provided. And we want to make sure that a recommendation is also provided. So when the developer takes this and put into the CI/CD pipeline, they will know exactly what to do. They can automate it and even try to fix it without having to come again to the architecture review board. The important thing here is that we are enabling the developers to move as fast as they can without any blockers from the architects. The standard has already been implemented, already been put in place and enforced through this specification. This is very simple, as you can see, but we can easily expand it to cover a lot more domains, a lot more functionality, a lot more what can I say, resources, right? So we can implement it even if we're trying to do something around spinning up some new infrastructure, right? If it was a code, for example, from Terraform, and we want to make sure that it follows the standard also been implemented by the architecture team, we can provide this type of schema and standards so that it can be followed if they want to use GenAI. And a lot of time they will be using GenAI, right? We're already in the GenAI era, so there's no hiding away from it. So let's run this. Okay. So now, if you see, this review is a lot different to what we had before. Before, when we asked it to run the review, we had this big blurb here. Not sure what ChatGPT was doing. It was making a improvement recommendation. It was an API versioning. You're currently using this version. Don't know exactly what standard was being followed here, and we can actually sit down with the architecture review board and the developer to try to understand exactly, okay, this is where you're going wrong. Based on what exactly? What are you going wrong there? But this is because the industry decided to use the following standard, and ChatGPT provided a review based on what the industry is currently promoting as best practice. Does not mean that internally is what we're following, right? So again, as you can see, a very long blurb. You have to discuss it. ChatGPT being very opinionated, probably hallucinating in some of the areas as well. But what we're trying to avoid is to be more deterministic, because if we do provide the same API open spec, again, open API spec, it should be able to provide us with the same recommendation, right? So not sure if you can see it, but same API, we provide the OpenAPI. Okay, those are the roles. The role number one that's been broken is all endpoints must be versioned using URI versioning. So view one resource. And as you can see, the violation endpoints are defined with a URI version. Okay, so e.g. events should be events and events ID. All the events endpoints, as you can see, do not have any version in front. So it's not been versioned. And one of the strict rules is that we need to be able to version it. So the severity is quite high for this one, as based on what we mentioned earlier in our severity. So what we already put here, all right, is high because it derives from the critical governance or security violations. So this is critical governance and security violation, and that's why it's been set as high, right? This open API spec that we also provided is violating one of the rules that we set. So we set a rule in rule number 3, which is all endpoints must define 400 and 500 response codes. Now, those endpoints do not provide any 400 or 500 response codes, which can also affect how end consumers, so client consumers, consume those APIs. If they don't know when an error is thrown, how to deal with that error, how to handle that error, right, or what to expect from those errors, then it's kind of they will have to implement their own version of interpretation of what's going on. So we need to make sure that the 500 is being written correctly with some of the messages that's required for that endpoint to help the client connecting, the integrating client, to make sure they're consuming the data correctly. All right. So rule number 3 is also being violated, right? So endpoints only define 200 and 201 responsive and do not define required 500 and 400 response codes, right? Recommendation, add 400 and 500 response definition to all endpoints. So as a developer, if I was at my desk and I'll run this violation review automatically, I will know exactly what I need to do to make sure that my API is compliant. Same thing with rule number 4. Okay. So now that is there any questions before we go even deeper into the bad prompt and what made it a bad prompt? Any questions in the chat? Sorry, guys, I cannot see the chat. Okay, so if no questions, I will move on to the next stage. Okay, so let's review what we did here. In order to make the prompt very deterministic, first of all, we provided a role for the Gen AI. So here we told ChatGPT, you are an enterprise architect. So we provided with a role, right? We also provided some more what the responsibilities are. So the responsibility here is to actually review the OpenAPI spec strictly against the architecture standards, right? And we also put some guardrails. Okay, what you can and what you cannot do. So we mentioned that you can ChatGPT can only evaluate against the provided standard, not use any generic API standard available on the internet or what's been trained with. Not to invent any rules. So this invent any rules stops it from hallucinating, right? ChatGPT, like any other LLMs, will invent rules when they believe that there's something missing. Now, that is their belief. That's why they've been trained. If they do not know something, they will make it up. They will just create it. They will become very, very creative about it. And we're trying to avoid that. Right. The next rule is to ensure that, again, the LLM, as I mentioned, ChatGPT, Claude, or any of those other LLMs, they all have the same issue. They should not assume that there's any missing information. As an architect, the information that you have provided should be the information that the ChatGPT or the Gen AI LLM should be working with. And they should not try to add anything if they believe that it is missing or is not being defined correctly, is not detailed enough, they want to go into more depth for it. That is not what we are asking from them, right? So we want to make sure that we let the LLM know that it should not assume any missing information. So not assuming missing information. Also, not to provide general best practices outside the standard. This is very important, right? So if we do provide some our own standard to the LLM, the LLM should not go and try to pick any best practices, which is falls outside those standards, and start providing recommendation for those. So we need to make sure that we do restrict it. We do provide these constraints so the application actually understand what we're expecting of them. And obviously, the focus of this session is be deterministic and structured, right? You need to be very deterministic and structured. If no violations are found, return an empty array. What you will usually get with our LLM, if there are no violations, it will probably make something up. And we do not want the LLM to be creative. Do not return some values that's, if there's no violation, don't create a violation. And don't try to come up with any other information that's not going to be relevant to the task. And that's what we're saying here. If no violations are found, return an empty array. Right. Now, the output is important because the output will allow the end developer to take the correct actions, right, to fix the issue. So here, JSON is used by most development developers and development language environments. Is one of the structure that we use for to describe our systems. So we asked that the LLM return the outputs in a JSON schema. So we provide the JSON schema. Okay, so not any schema that's on the internet, and that's not any schema that the LLM feels that is more adequate for this task, but we provide our own schema for the LLM to use. Then we also mentioned do not return explanation outside the JSON structure. We provide our own standards. I'm not going to go through the standards because the standards are just for this task, this session, and they're very basic as you can see them. But usually the architecture team will have a long list of standards that they can just provide to the LLM. All right. Now we want the output, as we mentioned earlier, the output needs to be in the strict JSON schema. So this is the schema that we provided. We also provided the definition of how to score each of the violations. So we have a low, medium, high. Now your team can have different definition of severity, but that's what we're working on now. And you can also expand it into how what suits best your team. And we saw the output very structured, and that is actually something that not only can be automated, the development team can work with, and we also enabling the development team to move on their own speed without having to wait for an architecture to review that for them. And go for the architecture review board, which probably take once a week, and that can create a delay that's not necessary. If the standards are already in place, it's a lot easier to reduce the same standard. As you can see, it is very structured. It has the role, the output structure, the scope limitation, and instruction specifically in the prompt. Now, what we did here is that we actually wrote an interface contract. But this is an actual contract. This prompt here, it will be a contract for how reviews are done. All right. Now, we already made it deterministic. And is there any questions? I'll leave the anybody want to ask for any clarification? I'll be looking to the chat. You can put some comments in the chat if there's any questions. Oh, apologies. There's a lot of questions in the. Very sorry for that. I was not looking to the chat for the Zoom, and I can see there's been interactive there. Okay, so we have a question here from Ruth. Okay, so what orchestration pattern do you recommend for coordinating multiple AI agents in production, centralized controller, event-driven architecture? Okay, we want to come back to that because that will take us away from the prompting. In AI native architecture, how do you structure the orchestration between layer, API, flows, workflows, deterministic, and auditable? We're actually going to we're going to discuss that in a second, how to automate the whole workflow. Because what we're doing here, if we can prompt it, we can create a service for it. We can create a microservice that will actually handle this for us, right? Where the developer can just provide the API, OpenAPI spec, and that microservice will return this JSON result for them. Okay, so those are some of the questions that we have now. If anybody wants to mention something, I can unmute the microphone and okay. Just let me get back to sorry, I lost my screen for a second. One thing I wanted to discuss because we already have this prompt, the prompt now, and the prompt already has I wanted to discuss guardrails basically, right? How do we stop the model from fabricating standards? We discussed that a lot. And what if it interprets the policy? So that's a very important thing to discuss, two very important questions. So the first one is, what if the model fabricates standards? And what if it interprets those policies, misinterprets those policies that we provide? So what we did, in order to stop it from a fabricating standard, we injected the standard explicitly in the context. So we provided the standard, right? So very simple standard. Do not invent any standard. Use the standard that I'm providing. And this is the standard that we provided so far. We made sure that it follows the standard, doesn't go outside the scope of this. And in terms of we made sure that also very important. So we have a version number for the standard. It's very important to version your standards because you want to come back and say, okay, this OpenAPI spec was validated against the architecture standard version 1.3. If the standard do change because you added extra or removed some of the rules, so you added or removed some rules, you want also to probably revalidate those APIs or the future APIs which do not provide versioning. For example, you remove version 1 versioning, so you remove the rule 1, and the new APIs coming in do not have version in it. We know which standards, architecture standard they were validated against. So in this case, version 1.4. Okay. So very important to version the standard, right? Now, if we want to something I want to add as well, the version gives us trustability. Right. We just mentioned earlier that if we do remove some rules or add some rules, we want to know which version of the standard added those rules. So that is traceability there. We can go back to that version and look at what was added. You can even look at the previous version and compare. Right. It's something that we can do. It's something that we can do as part of the architecture review, internally review, and then that is being shared across to everyone. And the architecture standard needs to be audited, logged somewhere, and audited, right? So if we can save it into maybe some service or some audit service that stores all the version and keep track on when any changes happen and how these changes happen. So this is the governance part. How do we upgrade the versions? Right. Now the architecture team can actually focus on that. Okay, so one thing, another thing I wanted to do quickly is if I go to draw.io, page is loading. 1 second. Okay. All right. So one thing we want to do is to turn this prompt into a component, right? We discussed that earlier, and we want to turn it into a component. So very simple. We have the client, right? And the client will probably have an API gateway. We will get into that. And what we want to do now is that we want to turn this review process into a component. And this component could be called something like our AI review service, right? The AI review service, where we will connect to our LLM. Could be ChatGPT, could be Claude, could be DeepSeek. All right. So once we have that LLM to the review, so we will go through it in a second. So we have the validator, and then we have the output, which is the response. Okay. So what happens is that the developer works at this layer, right? So the developer will, in a sense, is open API spec. So send this open API spec to the API gateway. We have our services running at the back of the API gateway here. And the AI review services, we take that open API spec and connect to the LLM. Now, what will happen, what we already discussed earlier when we were doing the prompting. So that prompt will be injected into the LLM with the OpenAPI spec. And then once the LLM and the OpenAPI spec come back with a response, we will run the validator. Okay, so the validator will make sure that, for example, we get a JSON output and we know exactly what the output is from the LLM, making sure that the LLM did not also invent any standard and deviate and follow the guardrails. Then the response will be returned back to the client in the JSON. Okay. Now, the other thing that we can also see is that this will also, LLMs are not free, right? So there's a cost involved every time you do make a query to LLM. You need to pay for those query, right? And because if the client keeps sending the same OpenAPI spec, and we know that API spec, we can also apply some caching. Okay, so the caching strategies can be based on multiple factors, right? So it could be, all right, there were no change between the previous spec that the developer sent and the new one. Therefore, it's very deterministic that it's going to be the same answer that will come back if there's no change to the API spec. And for example, the developer decide to run the build command, the CI/CD multiple times without making any changes to it. There's no point for us to start looking into making a call to the LLM because there's a token cost estimation, a token cost involved here. If the response is already there, we cache the response and we throw it back to the client. So this is where we turn in a prompt into a system component that they can use as part of the CI/CD for any of the system they're building. Now the architecture team now comes very close to the actual delivery, the code side of things. Right. The other thing, what we get also by having something like API gateway, right, is that we could get things like a retry. We can get a retry logic here as well. We can implement some of the scalability and anything else that we need to do. Okay. So even the caching also applies to if the development team are sharing the code and they have not merged the code yet of the new fixes that was applied in the OpenAPI spec, and another developer trying to run the validation. then it's best to have a caching instead of interrogating the LLM again. So return the cache response in this case and present it to the developer. Okay, so that is very important. Now, if we look at what I wanted to do is, I'm not sure if do we have enough time where you can probably share some of your own prompt. Right, you can, if you look at what the prompt was initially, and look at what the prompt was initially, and maybe if I put it in the chat, you can try to improve it your own way. Or if you have any questions around our prompting, do ask. Right, I will try to help you from, let's move from a bad prompt to an architect grade level prompt. Okay. So just the takeaway from this session, the takeaway from this session as well. Actually, before we go to the takeaway from this, I just want to come back to one of the diagrams. Okay. So this is a diagram I made earlier, or how you can actually implement deterministic system within your team. Okay. So the enterprise governance is where the architecture body is. We have our standard repository, we have our prompt templates. Okay. The architects will come together and create this standard, work with all the different teams, make sure that the delivery team is aware of the standard. The delivery team can also input, if one of the standard needs to be changed or needs to be adopted, make sure that the standard is relevant to the way they also work. But the architecture board will look at the standard, approve the standard, and have a repository for all the standards. Okay. You will also create some prompt template library and store those prompt templates, because those prompt templates will be loaded into the system that will actually be the execution plane. So if you look at the enterprise governance plane where all the architects usually live, right? This is where the standards are created. This is where the templates for the prompts are created. And this is where they're also stored for audits. They'll be loaded into this service, which is around the AI execution plane, created with the help of the delivery team, of course. And this AI execution plane is where we will actually have the LLM. Now, so we will inject the rules, we will inject the templates, and those rules and templates will be used by the LLM engine. In this diagram, I had the temperature 0.0. So that temperature is something actually that LLM do use. If you using LLM for an API, so you're not longer into the ChatGPT web application or the desktop application, you're actually interacting with ChatGPT or Claude or DeepSeek via the API. And one way to also make sure that their response is very deterministic is to change the temperature. The higher the number, so this 0.0, the higher the number, the more hallucination will be added to the output, the more creative the LLM engine will try to be. So if you want it to be deterministic, is set it to 0.0. The temperature of 0 will avoid it being deterministic. But that will also means that it will not be as creative as some other system will require. But as an architect, we do not want that creativity. We wanted to apply the standard, to follow the standard, right? So put the temperature to 0.0. And for traceability, as you can see from the execution plane, we want to make sure that everything we do are logged into the audit log. We know that if there's a new query coming in to run some validation, we do log that again into the audit log. Whatever version of the templates that we have, or whatever version of the standard we have, needs to also be logged into the audit log. So everything is audited. It's very important so that when you do get audited by a third-party organization, you can show them exactly how you actually validated how the architecture standard were enforced, and how the system that was deployed actually follows that standard. Okay, so again, the schema validator to make sure that the schema being generated by the LLM is conformant to what we specified. And any violation, okay, is stored, and we can also generate a report. And that will help the architecture team become more proactive and become more of an enabling organization for the delivery team. With this in place, we have the delivery team. All right. So the developer is working on his new endpoint, maybe a payment API. He already has the contract in place, so using OpenAPI spec, and then he submits those that new spec to the prompt assembler, which will come back with an answer within a couple of seconds, milliseconds. So okay, the OpenAPI that you provided actually follows what the architect already discussed internally for the architecture board, and there's no problem. It's been approved. So that's automatically approval of new design, new API design, and there's an audit trail for it. So if there's any question in the future around the spec, we can always go back to the audit log and we know exactly what that spec was, what in the OpenAPI spec was validated against, which standard was it validated against, and when was it validated against. So we have this traceability. All right, and we can, because we also remember the previous diagram had the open API gateway in front, so we know exactly who will run it and when it was run for that as well. So that is something that I wanted to discuss before we look into something that actually we touched on the role definition, we touched on the scope definition, structured output contract, context injection. We also touch on the version standard, the guardrails, post-processing validation, and observability, right? Now, this is what we call as an LLM control microservice. Right? This is now architecture as a service. And with architecture as a service, the team will be a lot more agile, they'll be a lot more efficient, and they will be able to deliver a lot more standardized features a lot faster. And this will improve not only cost, but also go-to-market. This will also reduce technical debt and bring the architecture team a lot more closer to the delivery team and shatter this ivory tower. Okay, so if you have this system in place, one of the questions I will ask is, will you trust this? Will you trust this to run to make sure that whatever has been pushed by the developer meets the standard? Will you trust this? And I believe so. I believe that you trust it because the system follows the standard that you put in place. Okay, and one of the questions is, how do we handle exceptions? Because the system here will automatically validate. And we mentioned that, okay, you are deviating from the actual standard. How do we mention exceptions? Because we have a validator that will return a fail. We can see the exception, we can see the audit log. We have the validation store that's also been stored. And we can have a report. But do we want it to be fully automated, where the developer does not interact with any architect because it's already automated through the system? Or do we want a human in the loop? Or should we say an architect in the loop in order to handle exceptions? I think that is something that the architecture board will have to discuss. And based on their own requirements, we'll see if a human in the loop is required or automation is better. All right. Okay, so we come to the end of the session. I hope that you all enjoyed it. And if there's any questions, please do let me know. We have session 2 starting next week. We will send some more invites again. We'll put the link into the chat. And so what we did today is that we engineered one AI component. Right, this is the AI component that we discussed. we engineered through the prompting, through better prompting, make sure that the prompt is structured. We provided context, we provided roles, we provided a standard, we provided what the output should look like. And so based on all that, we also discussed on how to automate it to make it more proactive for the actual developer to be able to automate it as part of their own workflow. So this is an automated architecture review workflow. Okay, and it can be run anywhere, right? So thank you for joining us. And session 2, the second event will be on how architects use AI to design systems 3 times faster without losing control. Right, so it will be a bit of a vibe coding for architects. Should we call it the vibe architecting? Not sure. So let's take the vibe coding now. So vibe coding for architects will be session 2, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you all. Any question? We actually have anything you want to add, Mr. Mohammed Mkwa? No? If not, thank you all. Bye-bye.